It's very good to be here today. Having just had the experience of moving from one family placement to another, what is it that you would be thinking that I should be doing? And one of the things might be a life story book. So I'm going to do a life story book around my experiences of permanence, both in relation to BAAF and then in relation to CoramBAAF. So this is about me, and it's very selective, but I think it is a kind of reflection on what really is a unique issue across the UK, that permanence is a very significant driver of policy for children. You don't find that in the rest of Europe. It's not a word that exists in the US, although they're probably as driven by that issue as much as we were. Okay, this was a very important book to me, Family and Kinship in East London. This is not the original cover, which was a standard penguin blue cover. And why it was so important, when I left home to go to university at the London School of Economics, this was one of the first books that I read. Now, one of the things about going to the LSE in the late 60s was that it would be an admired Jeremy Corbyn university. We protested, we sat in, we were committed to eradicating inequality and promoting social justice. And a lot of those issues, and I think we put ourselves at some risk at some point in protesting as vociferously as we did. One of the things that was really important in that is this book. Young and Wilmot, they published in '57. It was just over 10 years since or 10 years after that I went to LSE. And what it explores is the impact of community disruption in East London, particularly Bethnal Green, as a result of slum clearance. And even the word slum probably conjures up something of the issue that this was not a very nice place to be. But one of the things about that study is that, and unusually for sociologists, it had a very strong focus on social observation. So they talked to these families and they observed what they did. It was a beginning of a new approach, I think, to sociology and what it might contribute. So one of the things that was absolutely key to that it was a post-war community, and they identified at the centre of what was a slum community. It was trying to survive after significant bombing and disruption. It was a community which was very much identified by strengths, aspirations, and despite the worries and doubts and insecurities, and unemployment was a very significant issue as well, that strengths and aspirations at this heart of this community were very clearly identified by Young and Wilmot. And one of the things that they particularly identified was the importance of 3 or more generation families living in Bethnal Green, which were absolutely held together by the mother-daughter bond. Now, that might be multi-generational, but the mother-daughter bond. And on the basis of that, there was a very strong sense of mutual aid, a sense of community. And I think it probably said a lot to us at LSE, where we were trying to explore and think about these issues about social inequality, social justice, and trying to deal with those issues through the 60s and 70s. So there was a 50th anniversary celebration of that piece of work. Madeline Bunting from the Guardian said, the voices they found described a world rich in social relationships, networks of dependence and mutual support that was central to the people's resilience in facing the adversity of insecure and low-paid employment. So although to many respects, and I guess if one visited Bethnal Green, one might have been horrified by some of the things that we saw at that time, but at the centre of this was a set of families and community relationships which were enormously important in enabling those families both to survive and to prosper in their own particular way. So a very important study for me, and I suppose if I was asking that question, what does permanence mean to me? Maybe one of, and I think there's a lot of emphasis on being loved and being in a family. But that study probably says an amazing amount about what permanence actually is when one tries to kind of articulate it through those issues about family, networks of relationships, continuity over time. And I would think that for any of us, and this is a question I've often asked students, if a child in your extended family were to lose their parents temporarily or permanently, which would you opt for? To ask the local authority to step in and care for the child, or that would you step in and care for the child itself? Now having a granddaughter of 14 months, it is inconceivable, and I'm sure that it would be inconceivable to all of us to think that one would ever be the option that we would go for. Family and kinship, as much as it's changed over the years, probably is one of the most significant drivers, I think, that we have at the heart of who we are. So one very important influence, and I suppose if permanence means anything to me, it is about the creation of those relationships and those networks which are sustainable over time. Love definitely plays a part in it, but so does commitment and a whole range of other things. And I think that that question about the mother-daughter bond as a driver in that is very interesting indeed. This comes from another study which was part of my history. It's Jane Rowe. She was one of the originators of BAAF, published work for BAAF and published some enormously significant research material. And this was a quote that's in one of her publications following up her first study of what happened to children in care, and particularly the issue of drift of children in care. And she says the early social work strategy of wait and see, which she felt drove the system of drift, now emphasises the wait rather than the see, for social work activity shows a marked decline, particularly after the child's been in care for 6 months or more. And I suppose one of the things that I'm really struggling with, and I know a lot of people are struggling with at the moment, is that it does feel as though we're in a situation of waiting to see what is going to happen as Re-B and Re-BS winds its way through the system. Interestingly, given what Annie said about about number 10, I had a conversation. I was phoned by number 10 this morning, and the policy unit wanted to know what I thought about the rolling out of Re-B and Re-BS, and so now I wonder, are they going to be on to the civil servants in DFE? Oh dear. Anyway, I gave my piece. So that issue of wait and see, I think that we know that we mustn't wait and see. Children can't wait. We have a permanency plan at the 4-month review. We are driven by a whole perspective on child development which says we must not wait. But at the other sense, I also think that much of what's going on is requiring us to wait and see how the implications of Re-B and Re-BS work themselves out. This is another study which had a very significant impact. It was from Ian Sinclair, University of York, published in 2007 in Pursuit of Permanence. And he was reflecting on some of the issues through his study of 13 local authorities and about 5,500 children about this issue of permanency planning. And he, in that study, he says that of the children, those 5,500 children, 89% who entered care stayed for at least a week. They stayed for a week. 90% would stay for 4 weeks. If they stayed for 4 weeks, 89% would stay 12 weeks. And so we have still this issue of if that plan is not delivered early on, both in the child's life and in their entry to care, the likelihood of them becoming long-term care stayers is very significant indeed. And this goes back to Rowe's 1985 study, which established that whole concept of children in drift. And she found with the 2,500 children that she looked at, so these are the age groups of those children, so she broke them down into the age groups. The pattern is exactly the same. If you get to 20 weeks, the likelihood of you staying in care for a long period of time is very significant indeed, and that's irrespective of age. And it had a huge impact on me, this study, because BAAF as it was then, and with her an important part of that, we established I then worked at Goldsmiths College. We then established a partnership with BAAF to set up the first advanced childcare social work training in the UK. That certainly then for the next 15 years became a very important part of what I did. And so have we made any progress since then? Well, 1985 is the Jane Roe figures, the 2007 figures from Sinclair are the green line. So we have made progress. There is some activity, significant activity going on when we can do it to find a permanent placement which enables the child to go into a permanent family. But we certainly haven't got there yet. There are a lot of children that if we don't sort this out within the first 6 weeks, in the first 6 months, we'll have a significant life in care. So Ian Sinclair says a child, and this is in 2000, or 2000 to 2005, a child looked after for more than 6 months has a 60% chance of remaining in care for 4 years or more. If it's 12 months, then it's an 80% chance. So that issue about permanency planning, as much as it's become a driver, that it is something that, unless it happens quickly, and unless it happens to younger children, it's still become hugely problematic. Now, Ian Sinclair, and I'll just describe these models in that he has these different categories of children which came out of his research, but he says the leaving care curve reduces a build-up of a population of children requiring care and upbringing from the state. So these are children largely in foster care. But he says, although these children may be in stable placements, and they certainly might well be if they're under the age of 11, he identifies that many of them, because of the uncertainty of those placements they find themselves in, are deeply unhappy. But actually saying that, for those children to say that and to put that into words can be very difficult indeed. So he comes up with a model of the care system, and there are a number of groups. Those children that enter care under the age of 11, and for some of them they leave care quite quickly, but there's certainly that build-up issue which is very significant. Those children that enter care as young entrants but become adolescent graduates, so after the age of 11 they're still in care, although they started that experience before they came into care. Those who come into care as abused adolescents. I suspect that these are the young people that we've become more focused on in relation to child sexual exploitation. Adolescent entrants, where families for one reason or another have broken down, the adolescent comes into care. The issue about unaccompanied asylum seekers, and then the last, a group of disabled children. Now, he says a lot about all of these children. He has a very powerful message. We'll distribute these slides, but this is my picture of his model. So about 43% were young entrants, 26 adolescent graduates, 9% abused adolescents, 14% adolescent entrants, 5% unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and 3% disabled children. That last figure doesn't indicate the number of children in care who are disabled. And he says some very important things about these children. Nearly half of those abused adolescents have been in a placement for no more than 6 months. A significant part of instability, 18% have been in their placement for more than 2 years. So delivering permanence for those children is clearly problematic. So it comes back, and I suppose this is the issue that I struggled with throughout my career about this whole issue about permanence, is that it is the struggle with the issue of continuity and discontinuity. I think it goes back to that study of kinship in Bethnal Green, that continuity was a part of what those families experienced, but the material, financial and practical circumstances those families living, those families were living with the prospect of discontinuity as they were being moved out to Essex, Hertfordshire, some of the outer London boroughs as those slums were being demolished. So families having to live with discontinuity and discontinuity. And that we know one of the fundamental things for all of us, for the human species as a whole, is our capacity to adapt in order to survive. Our capacity to adapt in order to survive. And although we think about that in different sorts of ways, I think with children as they move into permanent placements, we are requiring them to adapt very significantly in order to survive that transition from one set of circumstances into a new set of circumstances. And I don't think there's any underestimating at all of what that actually means. Talk to any adopters, talk to any foster carers. It is a challenge of the first order. I think one of the keys to that is the issue about being able to learn to adapt. That as a human species, when we've been faced with challenges, our capacity to learn, unlike most other species, is extraordinary. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. That our capacity to transmit learning from one generation to the next is absolutely fundamental to that. And we have quite exquisite ways, both in terms of the way that we feel about things and the way that we think about things, that enables that to happen. Trust is absolutely core to learning, and secure, stable relationships are central to establishing trust. I just wanted to give you an example of this. I don't know if you know what this is. It was contributed by states in Coram a couple of hours ago, because I forgot to bring my version of it. It's a plasterer's trowel. Now, I've got, as I said, I've got a 14-month-old granddaughter. I could show her this, and I could say to her, "What do you think this is?" Well, maybe she's a bit too small for that. But there are lots of things where I'm trying to kind of say to her, and her parents are trying to say to her, this is what we do with this, and this is what we do, whether it's a fork or it's her bouncy machine that she's got. But if you think about it, I could say to her, well, this is a weapon, and I will use it to defend myself if I am attacked. And that could be right. I could say, actually, if I have mental health problems, that it was a really important part of who I am, being able to defend myself as I walk out onto the streets. I could say to her, well, it's sort of like a spoon, so if we dipped it into your yogurt, you could actually take it off to the end. Or I could say, actually, it's a plasterer's trowel, and one day maybe, if we get our education system right, we'll actually use a plasterer's trowel. Now, I have tried to learn to use this when I'm not working. I've never learned to work this because I've never had anybody to teach me. And I would need somebody to teach me. So I've tried it myself and it hasn't really worked. But the issue for any child is, why would they trust both my observations of what this is and what it's called, as opposed to anybody else's? And there's been quite a lot of research that's been going on in the States, which actually has identified that in the course of development, attachment is, I suppose, the most common concept that we've come to explore with this, but actually the cognitive issues that go along with attachment are hugely important in terms of a child actually trusting that if their parent says, this is an object and this is what we use it for, that they actually believe them. If a child has an insecure or a particularly disorganized attachment, their capacity to actually believe what their parent says to them is compromised by that issue. So it runs through all of these issues. If we're not establishing secure, stable relationships with children, their capacity to trust and learn is hugely affected by that lack of trust. And that then has a profound impact if we are not able to turn that around in the course of time. Well, I must remember to give that back to estates. Yes, never trust me again. So trust is an individual characteristic. Our capacity to trust and to do that well, I don't want to underestimate the significance of that, is an individual characteristic. But it's also something that exists in social groups. So the capacity in Bethnal Green of those families to trust each other is hugely important. It's key to our capacity to survive and adapt over time. And family life is a key social grouping within that capacity, within that social group. We also know there are issues about that. So what do we see in Syria at the moment? Or what do we see in any of the countries that are at war? Or what's happening with the migrant issue? There is a fundamental breakdown of trust as one community attacks another community and fights to survive. We can think about it in some of the issues that we personally struggle with, but it's causing huge turmoil in societies as a whole. as a capacity to defend and attack is actually used to adapt and survive. So these issues about our beliefs, our traditions, our connections, our ways of learning are hugely complicated, and as much as there are individual issues like the plasterer's trowel, these issues about the way that they affect our social groups is pretty fundamental. I just wanted to give an example of that. This is a family tree, and it comes from a judgment that was handed down about 18 months ago, and I think that the issue of trust is revealed in this. So here we have 3 children. They're all under 5. They were born to mum and to dad, and in the care proceedings, the primary issue is the domestic violence from dad to mum. And it was hugely problematic. It was very, very serious. And these 3 children were caught up in it directly. So the local authority removed the children, decided that the permanence plan was adoption, applied to the court for a care order and placement order. There was a viability assessment on grandma. The problem with the viability assessment was that she came from Jamaica with her 4 children. They were all adolescents, and actually the older one was the older adolescent, but he was still an adolescent. Her immigration issues were unresolved, and she tried to resolve that by going to Scotland to marry this guy as a marriage of convenience. She left her children in London when she did that, and she came back to see them every 2 weeks, but they were all cared for by this adolescent, the older adolescent. When the social worker undertaking the viability assessment asked her about any of that, she was not straightforward, and the social worker felt that she seriously misled her. So the viability said that she was not in a position either to be trusted or to work with the local authority in terms of taking care of these 3 children, and that's why the local authority had the plan for adoption. In the care order application and the placement order application, the family's lawyer said that that viability assessment did not take into account her cultural heritage or the way that she came to explain her understanding both about the position of these 3 children or indeed her life history. So the court appointed an independent social worker who was also Jamaican heritage, who came up with a much more positive assessment of her and her capacity to look after these 3 children, and a special guardianship order was made. Now, that's what the court decided. We could have a bit of a debate about that, given that of what we're doing at the moment in terms of waiting to seeing of just those kinds of issues. But from the child's point of view, how would we prepare those 3 children? What would we expect that grandmother to do in terms of preparing the children who were in foster care to come and live back with her immediately, because the special guardianship order had already been made, in terms of these questions about what happened to your mummy and daddy, and why are we going to live with them forever? That would have to be a part of their life story work and narrative over time. How would that grandmother help them to adjust and settle in, building relationships, establishing trust with them, given all that happened in the history of this family over time? What would the life story work actually look like? Who are you? What has happened to you? Who are the most important people, and what have been the most important experiences in your life? I mean, the demands on this grandmother and on these children and on those people that would be supporting her, I find quite overwhelming. It's a professional and it's a personal and family challenge of the most significant order. How that grandmother and those children adapt to survive in the context of what has happened to them, I don't think could be underestimated. Any permanent carer with those children would need to understand what the nature of the commitment was. Did she understand what special guardianship was? Did she understand what her legal status was and what the children's legal status was? What parental responsibility is? What their entitlements were? What the entitlements were of the birth parents that they could actually apply to have that special, or leave to discharge that special guardianship order, or contact orders. And how would she manage contact? This was her son after all. And how does she help the children to understand the significance of two family trees, the loss and the trauma for these children? I mean, we could go on and on. So I can say we, as humans, need to adapt and survive. That couldn't be a more fundamental issue when we're thinking about this concept of permanence. But we have a long way to go, and we're still waiting to see what the direction of travel, I think, of all of that is at the moment. We need to trust in order to learn. I don't think there can be a more fundamental issue than learning to trust other people. And for children that have been through these traumatic, awful experiences, to learn to retrust adults is fundamental. Relating and relationships are absolutely core to that. I don't think we could ever develop a permanency system which didn't recognise that as human beings we learn to trust when we are in relationships and we relate to one another, and family life is absolutely core to that. So as my final slide, and it is within the context of maltreatment, but defining that and identifying what that means, particularly for this large group of children, is quite a challenge itself. But I think for families, we cannot underestimate the challenge to any family, and that family that I've very hurriedly gone through with the special guardianship order, of what it means to rebuild trust and relationships with those three children at the centre of that. It couldn't be more important that we have responsive, non-blaming, evidence-aware family support services. They're absolutely key, both in the preventative measures that would be taken with that grandmother and those children. But actually, this is not a good start. Care proceedings are not a good start to developing relationship with the local authority that was responsible for that. And I think that we still have some way to go to identify how we have resourced and develop these services to ensure that the decisions that we make about vulnerable children, we're confident about how they're going to rebuild the lives in the way, as I said, that I would go back to thinking about in that study by Wilmot and Young.